Ecclesiastes chapter 1. It can also be found on your bulletins, up on the screen, and I believe on a paperback Bible if you wanted to go old school and live that analog life. Here we go. Under the inspiration of the Word of God, the preacher writes, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does a man gain by all the toil which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around it goes. And on its circuits the wind returns. All the streams run into the sea, but the sea, it's not full. To the place to where the stream flows, it flows again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been done is what will be, and what has been done is what has, let me try that again. What has been done is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who will come after." Let's pray and we'll be seated. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you so much for the gift of Ecclesiastes and how it gives us a steadfast path of living the good life. Pray right now for those of us here who are mourning, God, that you comfort us. For those of us here, Lord, that come in with burdens that we're able to lay them at the altar and give them to you. Lord, I pray right now for anybody here or watching from home that's not a Christian, God. I pray right now that this sermon points to you and your cross and your gospel, your good news. Jesus, thank you and I love you. In your name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. Okay, so real quick housekeeping about this sermon. Who here has read Ecclesiastes before? Okay, who here has listened to a sermon series on Ecclesiastes before? Okay, who here does not know what Ecclesiastes is about? Oh, only one person. Perfect. Okay, great. Only a couple people. One brave person and a lot of people who would not raise their hand at that question. So Ecclesiastes is going to be our main sermon series for the year. We're going to spend about 4 months in it now. We're going to take the summer off, talk about the supernatural, wrap up the book of Ephesians, and then spend about 4 more months in it in the fall. Then once we hit late November, we're going to do Advent, and that's going to be our year. Okay? I enjoy Ecclesiastes. It's one of my favorite books for the same reason Radiohead is one of my favorite bands. Because it's really uplifting and happy, right? No, because it's realistic, all right? The reason we called the sermon series The Good Life is not because your pastor is being ironic, okay? Ecclesiastes is written by a man at the end of his life who's frustrated and defeated in his quest for happiness. Because at the end of his life, he realizes what the good life is, and he completely missed it. Right? So what we're going to do over the next 8 months or so is we're going to look at the foibles and follies of the preacher, and we're going to see what not to do in order to find what the good life is that the Lord gives us. Okay? That's what we're looking at. Now, our sermon today is called Havel. That is a Hebrew word that we find. It's a very important word that is used in our sermon and all throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It's a word that you live and experience on a daily basis, from your morning drive to forgetting your keys in the car to like what seems to be 100% of your interactions with your spouse sometimes. We're going to get into that in a minute, okay? I'm just laying all this down. Now, the main idea of our sermon today, and this will follow us for the next 4 months, then 3 months off, then 4 months again, is this: life. What you're living right now, whether you're coming out of a really rotten week or having a wonderful week, life as a whole is Havel. Okay? Now, we're going to see 3 things in our text. Our sermon is 4 points, but 3 things in our text. We're going to see what the definition of Havel is. We're going to spend some time on that because that's the point of the book. Secondly, we're going to be seeing the futility of Havel. And then thirdly, we're going to be seeing the forgetfulness of Havel. Finally, we'll see the rescue from Havel, but that's towards the end of the sermon. So the definition, the futility, the forgetfulness, and the rescue. Let's get into it. So when we start, there's a couple things. Usually whenever we do a new sermon series, especially in a book, we like to do a little bit of background, who it was and all that. So it opens up and there's this phrase, and I think it's the same one across all the Bible versions. So if you've got a King James, ESV, New King James, whatever, it says the same thing. The words of the preacher, right? And what's really cool is that word preacher comes from the Hebrew word kohelet, and what it means is gatherer of wisdom. So whoever this guy is he did a lot of research all throughout his life. He gathered all this information, and he called all of Israel together, or he wrote this pen to all of Israel, and he said, all right, here's everything that I've learned. I want to share it with you, right? Now, the question then becomes, well, who is this guy? You go over, and it said, we get two hints. We see son of David, and then king in Jerusalem. Now, son of David is a term used to describe people who are of the lineage of David, obviously. It doesn't absolutely have to be his next of kin. You know, I have two sons of Larry. I have Ezra and I have Jude. If we were in Bible times and Jude or Ezra had kids, and those kids were boys, they could also be called sons of Larry, right? Now, the other hint we see is king of Jerusalem. So he was of David's lineage, and he was a king. Now, a lot of people, when they read this, will automatically think this guy called Solomon, right? Solomon was David's immediate son. Solomon had a very good track record when he was king. You can read about it, and I believe First Kings and First Chronicles. During his reign, there was no war. There was a lot of prosperity. A lot of things that we're going to read in the book of Ecclesiastes, you can find happening in Solomon's life. There's also a lot of words in here that are very similar to how Solomon would speak, like in the book of Proverbs, because he wrote part of Proverbs. I'm going to refer to him as the preacher the whole time, simply because we don't know 100% for sure. Okay? We don't know for sure. In fact, if you go, son of David and a king in Jerusalem, and you look at all these things that he did, a lot of kings in the Old Testament did these things, right? It'd be like saying such and such did so much as a president. Most presidents, outside of the one who made it for a month, did a lot of stuff, right? Yeah, most presidents, most leaders of countries, for good or for ill, they're very well accomplished. So rather than saying Solomon said this, he might have, he probably did. We can't 100% be sure. But we do know it's a very influential man at the top of the hierarchy in Israel who lived life more than any of us could ever hope to dream, even without the technology we have. And he ended his life feeling that life is completely Havel, right? So that's who it is. So what is Havel? That's a great question, right? If you've got your Bible, you find it like 5 times in verse 2. It's used, I think, 70 times in the entire book of Ecclesiastes. I'll read it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, right? Now, that word in Hebrew is Havel. That's what we call it, right? And that word, it's the word that you use for like a vapor or your breath after it leaves your mouth. You guys ever go to church in Ohio between the months of like October and March? And you're like, why am I out here? But after that, you breathe and you see that little vapor come out. That's what Havel is, right? It's just there for a second, not even a second, and it's gone. And you don't even remember that you did it. You remember that it exists. You remember that you do it, but you can't remember the exact breath that you drew. That's what Havel is at its base, right? Now, what happens is when we go through it, when we go through the book of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, he starts to take that word and he starts to mold it a little bit to mean certain distinctions and certain points. You see, the thing about me seeing my breath this morning when I got out of my car and regretted not wearing a coat, outside of not regretting a coat, is that there is no way I would ever remember that breath save for now. The breath was pointless, seemingly. The breath seemingly had no point. The breath was very short, right? The breath was just there for a minute. If you inhaled first through your nose, which I've learned not to do in cold weather, right? The breath was painful, right? It was almost seemingly meaningless. And you're like, so does any of that play into Havel? Yeah, all of it, right? Let me read this. There's a fantastic book I want to recommend. It's called Everything is Never Enough, right? and he defines what it means. I'm going to read it. It's a lengthy quote, but it's worth setting the table with. He goes, the most concrete sense of Havel is breath, air, vapor, because exhaled breath is weightless and apt to vanish. Other Old Testament writers use Havel metaphorically to characterize something that's insubstantial, ineffective, or worthless. For the Israelites, a political alliance with Elijah would be Havel, empty help, right? When a sage contrasts female piety and beauty, the latter, beauty, is Havel, because it's superficial and fleeting. The theological reasoning of Job's friends are Havel because they're missing the mark. Human life is Havel. It's vanity. Since life, like breath, it quickly disappears. The new car is Havel because the moment you drive it, it starts losing value. Beauty is Havel because age never subtracts wrinkles, it only adds them. Ecclesiastes uses Havel in all these senses and more. Throughout the book, the preacher custom molds Havel. He presses it into a new shape, rendering a fitting term that delivers his pitiless verdict on all of life. You could translate the preacher's opening statement, vanity of vanity, says the preacher, all is vanity, in many different ways, half a dozen different ways, each granting some purchase on the point, none completely exhausting it. For example, meaningless, meaningless, says the preacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. Perfectly pointless, says the teacher. Perfectly pointless. Everything is perfectly pointless. Absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. Utterly enigmatic. That's understandable. I had to look that one up. Says Kohelet. Utterly enigmatic. Everything is utterly enigmatic. Complete hot air, says Kohelet. Complete hot air. All is hot air. Utterly absurd, says Kohelet. Utterly absurd. All is absurd. You ever lived your life and felt one of those six things at a major junction in your life? Yeah, right? I remember when I graduated from college, I had to pay for it out of my own pocket, and I didn't learn how to study. So for me, graduating college was this really big thing. It took me 6 years to graduate. I had to take a year off for financial reasons. I had to do another semester because I failed a bunch of my classes. This was a major chapter in my life, and it was down in Jacksonville, Florida, and it was to go and to be in the ministry, right? I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Trinity Baptist College in Jacksonville, Florida, and it took 6 years and a major learning in my life. And I remember we went, and I walked, and I got the thing, and after that, my grandparents flew down, and my mom and my sister was already there, and we all went out to St. Augustine, the island, which is beautiful, right? And very wealthy. College kids have nothing to do there, save maybe wait tables. And we were at this really picturesque thing where we were at a fort overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, and the sun was starting to go down behind us in the west. We're looking at it in the east, and they were, to commemorate the time, they were stuffing the cannons and shooting the cannons blank because it was a fort, and without real balls because they didn't want to be on the news. And I was sitting there, and I was leaning over the fort, looking into the waters, and my grandmother was patting my back, rubbing it, as she did, because she loves me. And I learned this later, neither her or my grandfather, my mom, her and my grandfather were sure I was going to make it through college. Fair, right? And she said, I'm so proud of you, and I love you so much. And I remember thinking, what a waste of time. What did this get me? That's Havel, right? Continuing on. Doesn't get any more positive than this. Continuing on. Well, it does at the end. The preacher lays down his thesis statement for what we're going to look at for the next 8 months. 4 and 4. Don't leave, come back. Okay? He goes, if everything's meaningless, if everything's worthless, if everything's hot air, if everything's a waste of time, what does it gain a man by all of his toil at which he toils under the sun? Who cares, right? I want to parse this out because this follows us for the rest of the book, and I want to be really clear about what he's asking. He's asking a rhetorical question. The obvious answer is implied. We don't want to answer it, but we'll get to it in a minute. But I want to point out these two words. One is gain and the other is toil. When we talk about toil, it's not like the good sweat you have from a good workout, right? You know when you go and you have a good day at work, right? Whatever your work is, whatever the Lord's given you to do, whether you're retired or a stay-at-home mom or a bus driver or a nurse, or just whatever you do. You go, you punch in, you do the thing, you come home, and there's that feeling of I accomplished something today, right? That's not what toil is, right? Work, we're going to see later on, is a gift from God. Fatherhood and motherhood is a gift from God. Labor and working difficult, that's a gift from God. That's a good thing, right? You should feel some form, not ultimate, but some form of accomplishment when you go and do your job. Toil is like all the other days. You ever go to work and it's so awful you just don't listen to the radio on the way home, right? That's toil, right? You ever have like the day with the kids to where like you're going to move the clocks forward an hour so bedtime comes in an hour earlier, right? That is toil, right? You ever have a day where like your married life is clearly not what Hollywood said it would be? That is toil, right? It is, right? Well, what about gain, right? Because a lot of times we think about gain as like getting stuff, like experience points. If you play video games, I like to play video games. I like to play video games where you can level up your character, right? You go through a battle, then it does like a little victory song, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and then you get like 5 experience and your guy gets stronger. That's not gain. Gain is keeping, all right? What does all of the misery let you keep? That is what the preacher is asking. Now, there's 2 implied answers here, and people are split, and they're equally uplifting. All right? The first one is absolutely nothing, because our life is so short, and life, it's kind of like playing blackjack at a table where you can't bring your winnings with you. You can be as up as you want to be, but the house is going to keep that money. You can make all the money, have all the kids, in my position, have the biggest church, right? Have all the things, but one day you'll draw your last breath and none of that comes with you. So how much of that toil do you actually gain from? Anybody want to say it? None, right? The other one, it's just as uplifting. The other one, I've heard a couple commentators say, you know, everything is so big and we are so insignificant that what does our pile, whatever we accumulate like mean in the grand scheme of things? None. You're going to be hearing a lot of quotes from this comic, Calvin and Hobbes, by a guy called Bill Watterson. One of my favorite ones is where Calvin's taking a test, and he's like a 2nd grader or 3rd grader, and it says, "What is the significance of the city of Constantinople?" And then he writes underneath, "In the cosmic sense, probably nil." That's the point that that the preacher is getting after here. You know, when we look at this, what's really important. Okay, cool. What's really important that he's getting after is he wants to get at the point in the first 2 verses of the book that everything, success or failure, leads to this sense of emptiness. You know, what's the point of Constantinople? In the cosmic sense, probably nil. What do you take with you after you pass on? In the cosmic sense, nothing, right? And you're like, well, where's the good news? Well, it's not so much good news, but it's a fact. This Havel, man, it's part of human experience. The Havel I feel, the Havel I live, while it may be a different flavor, is the same Havel that you have. It's the same Havel that Republicans have after they lose the Senate and the House and the White House. And it's the same Havel that Democrats have when they lose the House, the Senate, and the White House. It's the same Havel we have when we get what we want and it's not what we thought it was. That's human experience. That's life. So first we see, right, the definition of Havel. Secondly, we're going to see I think futility. I changed it at the last minute. Futility of Havel, right? Please hang with me. It's going to be all right. I promise, hang with me, all right? So he goes on, and the preacher, he starts laying out these really big things. He goes from meaningless to talking about creation at large. He says these 4 things. The generation goes and comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and goes down. It hastens to where it goes. The wind blows to the south and goes around the north. Then around and around goes the wind. On its circuit, the wind returns. All the streams run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, they will flow again. significant. So I want to talk about, real quick, generations, sun, wind, and streams, right? And how big these things are. Generations are interesting. Actually, funnily enough, in Hebrew, it's just the word circle, right? And a generation is the length of time between one group of people being born and having children. This is really good news to our younger people. It's about 40 years, right? I meet a lot of people who are like, man, I'm 17 and still single. I'm going to die an old maid. Nope. You got like whatever 40 minus 17 is. You got plenty of time. It's about 40 years, okay? What's really interesting about that is since the time of Jesus till now, we've had about 45 or 50 generations, right? I Googled it. This is a safe thing because it was on a couple of sites. There's been approximately 117 billion people who have lived, found love or not, and died since Jesus' time. 117 billion, right? To put that in perspective, that's, how do I do this? Well, there's 8 billion of us now. It's like 15 times more the population of Earth. It's this big thing. And what'll happen is there's going to be another generation after millennials. That's Gen Z. There's going to be another generation after Gen Z. That's Gen Alpha. There's going to be another generation after Gen Alpha, Beta. They're going to be known for being passive probably, right? You know what? I thought that was funny. Moving on, and what happens is it keeps going, right? And then you go over it, and then he starts talking about the earth, and it talks about the sun rising and setting, and there's this misnomer that, the Bible's an anti-scientific book because it's not talking about the earth rotating, but rather the sun going up and down. That's not correct. He's being poetic here. This is a poetic wisdom book. And what's really interesting is the reason we get to see the sun go up is because of the earth's inertia, right? So the earth is spinning around the sun, and what happens is because there's no pressure pushing against the earth's rotation, man, it's just going to keep going and going and going. And do you know what that means? Tomorrow there's going to be a sunrise. And do you know what that means? Yesterday there was a sunrise. And in 20 years ago, you know what there's going to be? Another one. And you know what there was back in the preacher's time? Some sunrises, at least 4 of them, probably more, right? And then he continues on, and then he starts talking about the wind. He knows preachers are going to be preaching this for thousands of years, so he starts talking about hot air. And he goes, listen, the wind, there's these currents, and it's really cool. I looked up how wind works this week, and it's super interesting because wind happens when hot air goes up and cold air goes down, and then there's some pressure based on the two, so it blows, right? And what happens is he even talks about circuits because, believe it or not, round and round, there are jet streams in the air that go around the earth, and as far as we can tell, they've been there as long as we've been here and even beforehand, and they'll be there afterwards. The reason we call them jet streams is because that's what we try and put our planes on and jets on when we travel around the country, right? And then he talks about water, and I learned about water tables, but we're running short on time, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But what happens is, I love it. He goes, listen, the streams, they go into the sea, but the sea's never full. And then the rain comes and it fills up the stream, and he's talking about this cycle. I love it because, it's warm on the oceans and it's warm on the lakes, so it evaporates water, and then the water goes to where it's coldest, usually super up high, right? And then what happens is it goes to, a lot of times, the coldest place on the earth, and then it gets too dense and too hot, so it turns into rain and it drops. And it just goes into this really big circle. Yep. So we have this generation circle. We have this rotation of the earth circle or the sun circle. We have this wind circle and we have this water circle. And what happens is he says these two things, and it's really important. He goes, listen, all things are full of weariness. Well, what do you mean by that? 2 things. One is these things have been happening again and again and again and again and again since before the dawn of human history. The teenage boy with the mustache that I don't know, but I already hate on behalf of my daughter, right, has existed in principle since the dawn of time, right? And he goes on, he says this really interesting thing. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, and the ear is not filled with hearing. So just as these circles and circuits are as old as life and time itself, so is the desire for a little bit more. So is the desire to hear something new, right? And you know what that is? It's futile. Very futile. Or what the preacher says is he uses the word weariness. That word weariness is very key here and important. It's the monotony of an endless cycle of repetition, right? There's that old, I think it's a Greek fable or Roman fable, probably both, about Sisyphus, and he's the guy who has to roll up the boulder to the top of the hill, and it always rolls back down. That bowl has always been rolled up the hill in all things. That toil that you feel, that want that you feel, that more that you want. Can't my property line be bigger? Can I have a better car? Here's a game I used to play with, to myself early on in church. It's how many people are enough. So if we had 50 people, would 51 have been enough? If we had 51, would 52 have been enough? And the answer to how many people are enough for the church is the same answer that John Rockefeller answered when they asked him how much is enough wealth. Just a little bit more, right? How many praises can we hear, right? My wife loves me, and I know that because she heaps kind words upon me. And though I put on a tough exterior, I can never hear enough because of how insecure I'll always be, right? And what we look at here is a lot of times we think we can create ourselves out of the doldrums of life, right? We're in a very positive way, we're very American in that we innovate, and we can innovate our way out, right? We're always getting new boots, so we can pull ourselves out by those bootstraps. When the reality is, that sentiment is as old as the rotation of the earth. And it's weary. I'm looking at the life going out of our young moms right now, right? Like every night, Dino Nuggets. Yeah, every night, right? And what happens is there's this really important picture that he's painting here, and it's the groaning of creation that we all share in, right? If you come to church often, you hear the phrase creation, fall, redemption, restoration. It's the story of the Bible. Things weren't created to be like this. We'll get to that at the end of the sermon. But the idea is that because sin is in the world and things aren't as it should be, there is this weariness. Paul talks about this about 1,500 years later in the book of Romans. He says, we know that the whole of creation has been groaning together in the pangs of childbirth until now. Not only creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we inwardly groan as we wait eagerly for the adoption of our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies, right? What happens is we know this cycle isn't for us. We groan to get out of it. Maybe this new movie or game will put the series back on track. We'll find out. And even if it does, it's futile. It reminds me of a movie. I like semi-artistic movies. And there's this movie that came out about 20 years ago called Eternal Sunshine on the Spotless Mind. I'm hoping for one hand. Has anyone heard of it or seen it? 2 hands, 3 hands, triple. All right, man, I'm knocking it out of the park. That's great. So let me give you the story, and then we'll tell you about the end of the movie, and then we'll tell you how it goes in perfectly with what we're talking about today. So it's, in my opinion, one of Jim Carrey's best movies. Okay, once or twice a decade, he'll play a serious role, and he'll knock it out of the park. Right? Truman Show, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, 23 to a much lesser extent, but the guy can act, right? And as a side note, we are not recommending this movie. We're just talking about the plot. Okay. It also has Kate Hudson of Kate Hudson fame, right? And they play this ex-couple called, let me find my notes real quick because it's important to get their names right, called Clementine and Joel. And here's the whole setup of the movie, right? So there's this guy, Joel, who undergoes this procedure to forget his ex-girlfriend, his longtime ex-girlfriend, Clementine, right? And there's this procedure that Clementine goes through to forget her long-term ex-boyfriend, Joel. So Jim Carrey, Kate Hudson, they forget each other. And the whole plot of the movie is them meeting each other afterwards and re-falling in love at the same time as regaining their memories as to why they fell out of love. Does that make sense? I'll try again, buddy. Okay. Every week. It's like a big circle, right? So what happens is there's a guy and a girl. They're dating. goes off the rails. They break up. The breakup is so bad that they have these procedures done to forget the other person. Then they meet each other and they fall in love again, only to find out that they were bad for each other. Okay, you got it. Good. Okay. So what happens is they go through, and it's this very dramatic movie because you see these highs of like new and blossoming romances, and they're oftentimes juxtaposed with these lows of a relationship falling apart. And in the movie, the characters, at the same time as us, the viewers, are finding out about it. And what happens is it's not a will they, won't they movie. It's a will they, won't they again movie, right? And you get to the final scene, and they figure out why they broke up, and they saw themselves being miserable, and they leave, and what happens is Clementine runs out, and Joel follows her, and I want to read this to you. He goes, Jim Carrey, Joel, he stops her and goes, listen, I can't think of a single thing that I don't like about you, right? Clementine responds, and she says, but you will, and you're going to think of those things again. And then I'll get bored with you, and I'll feel trapped, because that's what happens with me, and that's what happened with us. And they're in this stalemate. Do we pursue this fleeting happiness, or do we stay in this loneliness, right? And the movie ends with Jim Carrey's character, Joel, saying, okay. And they both start crying, and they run out the door holding hands into the snow. And a lot of people think it's such the most uplifting thing. I would argue that's Havel. Why? Because those characters, Joel and Clementine, while reunited, are still on that same weary circle as the earth and generations, right? And the wind and the sea. See, what happens is we try so hard to escape Havel. We try so hard to find meaning. We try so hard to make our breaths last longer. And what the preacher says here is it's futile. You can breathe out as long as you want. One day that breath will stop, right? You can make all the money you want in the world. One day it will not come with you. Larry, you can have the biggest church ever. Not just 53 people, right? And you will move on, whether it's breathing your last breath or retiring or whatever, right? All of it is what? It's futile. So first we see the definition of Havel. Secondly, we see the futility of Havel. Thirdly, we see the forgetfulness of Havel. Hang in there, right? He goes on and he says this, what has been will be, and what has been done will be done. So here's what he's saying, right? The stuff that we're doing right now has been done in the past, and the stuff that has been done in the past, we're doing it right now, right? Then he goes on and he says, there's nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing which is said, see, this is new? It's already been done ages again. Now, once again, he's being poetic here, right? The preacher, he's not talking about like Chat GPT. They didn't have that back in the day, right? You know, he's not talking about whatever you want to fill in here. What he's talking about are these overall waves of human nature. You know, human nature, what I love about the Bible is the Bible was completed, the canon was closed 30 or 40 years after Jesus rose from the dead, and it's still applicable today, it's still life-changing today. Do you guys know why? Human nature doesn't change. We're not any different than we were back 2,000 years ago, and the Romans weren't any different back how they were 2,000 years before that. People don't change, right? You're like, well, Larry, I met Jesus, and my life is completely new. Just wait a little bit. We'll get to that in a minute. But by and large, people don't change. In fact, there's this song that I like a lot that talks about it. It's called Blurry Face. It says, I wish I found some better sounds that no one's ever heard. I wish for a better voice that sang some better words. I wish I found some chords in an order that is new. I wish that I didn't have to rhyme every time I sung. I like that. I wish that when I was older, my fears would all shrink. But now I'm insecure and I care what people think. He is laying, the songwriter, who's a believer, I believe, in the fact that we, in an area, a culture of being individualists and being different, we can't be different, right? You know, like I love it because there's millions of Gothic teenagers today who are telling people how different they are, right? Like, you know, Marilyn Manson has sold tens of millions of albums, right? You know, there's tens of millions of kids with Williams syndrome in the world, right? Like, We aren't as different as we'd like to be. There's been a previous generation who knows about Invader Zim, right? That's that whole thing, right? And what happens is the point that the preacher is making here is anything we think is new isn't. And here's why we talk about forgetfulness. He goes, there is no remembrance of the former things, nor will there be any remembrance of the later things yet to be among those who come out after. Here's what he's saying. Let's go back to those 117 billion people over the past 2,000 years. They've all done these waves. There's been plenty of goth and emo phases all throughout the Western and Eastern culture for the past 2,000 years. And here's where the preacher drops the hammer. Nobody remembers any of them. I was hit here, and we'll quote Bill Watterson again. Once again, Calvin and Hobbes. There's this beautiful quote where Calvin, the 6-year-old, he's in the backyard surrounded by dark and the stars. In the first panel, he goes, he's yelling the words, I am significant. And then there's a gap where he's standing there. And then the final panel, he says, screamed the speck of dust, right? When it comes to significance, we aren't. And you're like, well, Larry, what about like Hitler or Abraham Lincoln, right? Because we know those guys. Yeah, we're not either of those people, right? Of the 117 billion people who came before us, how many can you name? And of the people who come after us, who's going to be able to name you in 150 years? To some of us, that might be a relief. To a lot of us, myself as somebody who's marginally in the public eye, that's a scary thought. And that's what the preacher opens with. And that's what I was going to finish the sermon with, but like, that's not where the story ends. It is really important. I think there's a fourth point, and it's this. It's the rescue from Havel, right? Because what happens is this is the reality that everybody's living it. To our people who are older, I'm going to give kind of like this, I want to do a longer transition until we get to the escape. There are record numbers of people who are like Gen Z, so kids in their lower 30s and down, who have just given up on life, right? You know, like I read articles like this every couple of weeks, and it makes me nervous about my hobby. But like, there's more and more men playing video games at 7 to 9 hours a day than ever before. And there's like a couple of reasons for it. One is there's just better video games out there. 2 is that they're built in an addictive nature. And 3, many young men have just given up on getting a job or a wife or a home or like getting out of their apartment, right? And like the answer is why, right? You know, why do people not pursue romance anymore? Why do people go for, why do people avoid any kind of moving up in the world? Why do people avoid these things? Why does it seem like a large generation, like an entire generation has seemingly given up, right? Here's my theory, and I don't have anything to go along with it, but I think I'm right on this, right? You know, for the past like 15 years, 20 years, we've had the internet, and we've been able to search out all these things. And I would argue that a lot of younger people have come to the conclusion that the preacher has come to. Life is a vapor. It's meaningless. It's hard. It hurts. Why bother? What you see is this rise in our greater culture in nihilism. Who cares? In distractionism. In hedonism. Distractionism being finding something to do while the world burns. Hedonism being finding pleasure while the world burns, right? And what happens is when we go through the book of Ecclesiastes, he does all of those things. So is there a way out? And that's where we get to the last one, the escape of Havel. You see, what we have is when we read the Bible, we have to read every text in light of its whole. So we read, most likely Solomon, the preacher, talking about how he feels he wasted his life. And there's like really positive stuff in Ecclesiastes that we get to, but it completely demonstrates what's wrong with our world. We feel that there should be something right. Like, I've been struggling with this sermon since Monday, right? It has cost me sleep because the words that came out of my mouth, I don't think anybody was happy to hear. I don't think anybody could disagree with anything I've said thus far. Is there an escape? There is. That escape, and you probably know this if you're a Christian, it's found in Christ. You see, what's really interesting about Havel is the idea that life is bad and pointless. We go over to John chapter 10, and Jesus is talking, and he calls himself life on purpose, but he says this. Jesus says again to them, truly, I say to you, I am the door to the sheep. He who came before me, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to him. I am the door. If anyone would come to me, he will be saved, and he will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes to kill and destroy. I come that you may have life. And you're like, yeah, Havel, right? Garbage life, right? No, Jesus says, I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. What I'm so thankful for, and what I pray for our younger men and women to understand, is that, yeah, there's a lot of awful stuff going on in the world, right? This comes up once every few months as things get dropped or not dropped. You know, there's that gentleman, that man who did a lot of child trafficking around the world, and the people that he associated with was hidden. And, you know, some of it's kind of coming to light, and that, like, the list gets bigger and bigger. And if you read what went on in there, what happens gets darker and darker and darker, right? And you're like, how could I have hope? Well, Jesus says, well, have hope in me because I defeated death and therefore them. And also I'm a righteous judge who judges them as well. You see, what happens is, it's not that the circles themselves are bad. It's good to have sunrises and sunsets. It's good to have winters. It's good to have summers. It's good to go home to be with the Lord. What Jesus does is that he takes our lives that seem worthless and he makes them abundant because we are reconnected to the one who created us. You know, that's important because a person who lives by himself farming coffee beans in a third world country can have a fuller life than any of us than any of us here, not because it's a simpler life, but because he can be connected with the Creator. You know, you can have learning disabilities, never graduate elementary school, middle school, high school, but you can have a relationship with Jesus Christ and you can find meaning and purpose in your life. You could have the perfect white picket, 2.5 kids, which I'm not sure how that works, plus a dog, plus the perfect 9-to-5 job, and you can still find happiness. Right? Kevin Spacey in that movie American Beauty was dead wrong when you factor in Jesus Christ. Right? Well, how do you know? Because for thousands of years, there have been men and women and children from all backgrounds who've met Jesus Christ and found these things. You know, what's crazy is we look at these things and we're like, our life is so short. No, it's not. You see, what happens is we were born, but we have life without end. You know, let's look at this. It says this over in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. This is the end of time / the beginning of eternity, which is a whole other sermon. We'll talk about it over the summer. It says, then the angel came and he showed me a river of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb, and in the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side, the tree of life with 12 kinds of fruit, each yielding its fruit of each month. The leaves of the tree were the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed. No longer will there be Havel. But the throne of God and their Lamb will be, but there will be healing for the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in it, and the servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be night no more, and there will be no light or lamp or sun, for the Lord God is their light, and they will reign forevermore. Right? Our life isn't short or insignificant or pointless if you know the Creator, because the Creator is light. Right? I wanted to turn on that because life feels so awful, what seems like all the time. And I would just, if I had my way, I'd just unplug and go live in the woods somewhere. And it's not that I don't get to, because I technically could. It's that I don't have to. We get here and he says this, let me make sure I have this. Yeah. A lot of times I feel not alone, but forgotten, just because, like, I'm one of the unwashed masses, right? And, you know, Jesus says this. He says, but I tell you, my friends, don't fear those who kill the body. After there, nothing can be done that they do. But I warn, pardon me, but I warn you to fear he who has the authority to cast you into hell. Fear him. And you're like, what? I thought we were being positive. Here's what Jesus says after that. Are there not 5 sparrows who were sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten by God. Right? Why, even the hairs on your head are all numbered. So that 117 billion people, he knows the individual hairs on every head of every person who's lived and died, and how many they've gained and how many they've lost. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. Your life matters, even though it's Havel. Well, who does it matter to? Well, it doesn't just matter to you, it matters to your Creator. So what do we do with this text? Great question. I think there's a couple of things. This is going to sound counterintuitive. I don't think it is. The thing that lingered with me after I'd go through the text and then like breathe into a paper bag because I knew I had to preach this on Sunday and then go back to the text is there's this weird lingering sense of comfort, right? And let me explain why, right? I think a lot of times we are prone to think as people that whatever negative thing is happening to us has never happened to anybody but us, right? You know, I have kids. I know children who are the only children in the history of existence to have to do math homework. No, it's never happened to any of them but that one kid, right? They're on my bus. They're elementary school kids, right? They're like, Mr. Leary, have you ever heard of addition? I've never heard of such barbarousness and cruelty, learning 2 + 2, you know, that kind of thing. You know, what's really great is the suffering we go through, the Havel we go through is common. You're not alone. I didn't have a great father growing up, and that hurt a lot. There's been billions upon billions of young men without fathers. And many of them have been rescued through Christ. There's hope. Secondly, is this, you know, we look at what's wrong in the world. God has been judging wicked men and women since the dawn of time, and he will continue to judge wicked men and women until the dusk of time. A lot of times we'll see things on the news, and frustrating, it's more than frustrated. You know, frustrating is like throwing up your arms, right? Like, there's like, who cares? I'm just going to give up and make funny jokes about it, right? That's the wrong move. Why? Because God is just, and he will take care of it. Thirdly, is this big thing, when we look at these cycles and circles, how minuscule things seem to be, right? An important phrase to remember from me is this too shall pass, right? Whether it's today, tomorrow, in a decade, or 10,000 years. You know, in 10,000 years, those of us who are believers are all going to be with Jesus, and we're all going to perpetually be having the best day of our existence. And it's going to be really hard for me to remember in 10,000 years the awful week that I came out of, whether it was this week or a year ago or a decade ago. So the best thing we can do is, with those things in mind, we give our lives to Christ, and we do our best to glorify him with the life we have. And then you go, well, Larry, what does that look like? We're going to see that over the next 8 months. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for Havel. Well, let me try that again. That sounds masochistic. I'm very thankful that the preacher, under your inspiration, wrote an entire book about the shared human experience. And everything's not awesome. A lot of things seem pretty awful and short. And you knew that, so you gave us Ecclesiastes. And you knew that that was the state we were in, so you gave us Jesus Christ yourself, so we could live abundantly in the midst of Havel with the hope of one day seeing you face to face, which we will. I want to pray right now for all of us in here, God, as we see what is real in the world and know that our ultimate reality is not end here, but it is completed in you. Please help us find hope in you. Please help us, God, be faithful to what you call us to do. Please help us seek justice with the understanding that justice will one day be had by you. Lord, I pray for anyone here who's not a believer, God, that they give their hearts to you. Pray for anyone here who's downtrodden and discouraged, Lord, that they hope in you as well. Jesus, thank you so